where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You've been taught that first impressions matter, right? That you should trust your gut about people. That if everyone's saying the same thing about someone, it's probably true. Well, what if I told you that sometimes, the most important times, everything you've heard is a lie? Not because people are intentionally deceiving you, but because the truth is buried so deep beneath layers of gossip and fear that nobody's bothered to dig for it. This is the story of a woman who married a monster. Except he wasn't a monster at all. He was just a man who'd learned that being feared was safer than being hurt. And on the night she expected violence, cruelty, the confirmation of every terrifying whisper she'd heard, he said 4 words that changed everything. "I've been waiting." Waiting for what? For someone brave enough to ask who he really was, instead of believing who everyone said he was. Here's the uncomfortable secret nobody talks about. We destroy people with our assumptions. We build entire narratives about strangers based on fragments of information, third-hand stories, and our own projections. We turn complex human beings into simple villains or heroes, never considering that maybe, just maybe, there's a whole hidden story we're missing. Eleanor walked into her marriage, convinced. She was entering a nightmare, her body literally shaking with terror about the man she'd been forced to marry. Every story she'd heard painted him as cold, cruel, heartless, a duke who'd ruined families, who looked at people like they were nothing, who'd made a woman run from his estate in tears. The reputation preceded him into every room like a dark cloud, like a conspiracy everyone had agreed to believe without question. But here's what nobody tells you about reputations. They're almost never the whole truth. They're the visible 10% of an iceberg, while 90% of the real story stays hidden underwater, unseen, unknown, lost in silence. Ashbourne, the terrifying duke, had spent years building walls so high that nobody could hurt him again. He'd been betrayed, used, exploited by everyone who got close, so he became untouchable. He created a persona so intimidating that people kept their distance automatically. It worked perfectly as protection. But the price? He'd forgotten who he actually was beneath the armor. He'd become his own mystery, a secret even to himself. And he was exhausted, bone-deep tired from maintaining a mask 24 hours a day, from never being allowed to be vulnerable, from living in a golden prison of his own making. That wedding night, the one Eleanor had dreaded for weeks, the one that had given her nightmares and stolen her appetite, turned into something neither of them expected. Instead of the monster she'd prepared for, she found a tired man who took a step backward to give her space. Instead of cruelty, she heard a quiet confession. "I know the stories. I created them." And when he sat on the floor, an actual duke sitting on the floor, like a regular human being who'd simply run out of energy to pretend, and said, "I've been waiting for someone who'd see me as a person," everything shifted. 2 prisoners recognized each other through the bars of their separate cells. 2 people drowning in expectations found someone who understood what it felt like to suffocate under the weight of other people's versions of who you should be. Here's the paradoxical truth that'll make you question everything. The people with the worst reputations are often the ones protecting the deepest wounds. The coldest person in the room might be the one who's been burned the most. The one everyone calls heartless might be the one who cares so much they had to build walls just to survive. We live in a world that punishes vulnerability and then criticizes people for being closed off. We create the conditions that force people to hide, and then we gossip about why they're so mysterious. We spread stories without bothering to verify them, and then we're shocked when those stories turn out to be incomplete or entirely wrong. Eleanor almost lost the love of her life because she believed the gossip instead of asking one simple question: who are you really? This story is going to challenge everything you think you know about judging people, about trusting reputations, about the difference between who someone appears to be and who they actually are beneath the surface. You're going to discover why Ashbourne became the man everyone feared, what really happened with those ruined families and that crying woman, and how two people built something real in a world built on performance and pretense. You'll learn the specific steps they took to create trust when trust seemed impossible, and why their story matters more now than ever in our world of instant judgments and social media reputations. By the end, you'll never look at gossip the same way again. You'll never hear "everyone says" without wondering what's hidden in the silence. And you might just realize you've been doing to others exactly what was done to Ashbourne, judging the visible surface while remaining completely ignorant about the truth underneath. So let me ask you something before we dive deeper. How many times have you believed a story about someone without ever speaking to them directly? How many relationships have you avoided because of what others told you? How many monsters have you created in your mind that don't actually exist? Because here's what Eleanor discovered on that wedding night, the thing that changed her entire life. Sometimes the people we're most afraid of are just people who are afraid too. Sometimes the walls that keep us out are the same walls keeping someone trapped inside. And sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to ask, "Who are you really?" instead of accepting the story everyone else is telling. In the weeks before the wedding, Eleanor did what anyone would have done. She tried to figure out who the hell she was about to marry. And man, every single story she heard was worse than the last. It's like when you're scrolling through reviews of a restaurant, and each one's more terrifying than the previous. Horrible service. Got food poisoning. The chef yelled at me. You start wondering if you should just stay home and eat crackers instead. That's exactly where Eleanor's head was at. She wasn't getting cold feet. She was getting frozen, terror-stricken, completely paralyzed feet. The whispers came from everywhere. Distant relatives, old friends, even the servants who'd worked at neighboring estates. They spoke in hushed tones, like they were sharing forbidden secrets about some dark enigma that lurked in the shadows. They said he'd bankrupted 3 families over petty debts. Not massive scandals or grand conspiracies, just small amounts that apparently meant nothing to him, but everything to them. They said he never attended parties because he despised company, that he looked at people like they were insects beneath his polished boots. There was this one story that really got under Eleanor's skin. The tale of the last woman who'd tried courting him. She'd left their meeting in tears, practically running from his estate like she'd encountered something hidden, something sinister that no one should ever face. These weren't just rumors. They felt like vestiges of truth, little traces of evidence that painted a monster she was contractually obligated to spend her life with. Each story added another layer to this terrifying portrait, and Eleanor couldn't escape it. This reminds me of when I moved to a new city for work. Before I even arrived, my future colleagues had already filled my head with stories about that manager. She's cold, they said. She's impossible to please. She'll tear your work apart without blinking. By the time I actually met her, I'd constructed an absolute dragon in my mind. Fire-breathing, merciless, waiting to destroy me. And you know what I did those first few weeks? I avoided her, kept my distance, interpreted every glance, every email, every tiny interaction as confirmation of what they'd told me. It was like I'd been handed a script, and I was determined to see the play unfold exactly as described. That's the thing about gossip. It doesn't just inform you, it programs you. It creates a filter through which you see everything that follows. Eleanor reached a point where she couldn't eat anymore. Food tasted like ash in her mouth. She'd have these nightmares where she was trapped in a cold, silent mansion with a man whose face was always in shadow, always just out of reach. She'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. During the day, she'd look at her wedding dress hanging in the corner, this beautiful, elaborate creation that should have filled her with joy. And instead, she'd feel nausea rising in her throat. This wasn't wedding jitters or normal pre-marriage anxiety. This was pure, primal terror. The kind that makes your body go into survival mode without your permission. The kind that whispers danger in every quiet moment. You know that feeling when you've got to do something that absolutely terrifies you and your body just revolts? Your shoulders tense up without you even noticing. Your breathing gets shallow and quick, like you've been running even though you're sitting perfectly still. Your stomach ties itself into knots so tight you wonder if they'll ever come undone. That's where Eleanor lived for weeks. Every single day. She'd catch herself holding her breath at random moments, or realize her hands were clenched into fists so tight her nails left little crescent marks in her palms. Her body knew something her mind was still trying to process. She was walking toward something that felt like a trap, and every instinct screamed at her to run. But running wasn't an option. The arrangements were made. The contracts were signed. Her fate was sealed. If you've ever spent sleepless nights worrying about something that hasn't even happened yet, if you've ever built an entire horror movie in your head about a future situation, you understand Eleanor completely. We've all been there, haven't we? Lying in the dark, playing out scenarios, imagining worst-case outcomes, feeling that sick dread settling into our bones. Maybe it was a job interview, a difficult conversation, a medical appointment, or meeting someone important. Your brain goes into overdrive, creating elaborate stories about disaster and failure. And here's the messed up part. Sometimes we're so convinced by our own fictional narratives that we forget we made them up. They start feeling like prophecies instead of possibilities. Eleanor was drowning in prophecies of doom, each one seeming more inevitable than the last. But here's the truly dark detail, the real enigma at the heart of this whole mess. She never asked him anything. Not once. Not a single question directed at the actual man she was about to marry. She built her entire understanding of him from second-hand sources, from gossip, innuendo, and stories told by people who probably had their own conflicts and conspiracies at play. She believed versions of a man created by strangers over the reality she could have discovered herself. And look, I'm not judging her here. I'm really not. Because you and I? We do this constantly. We accept other people's versions of reality without question. We let others define the characters in our story before we even meet them ourselves. I've done exactly what Eleanor did, probably more times than I'd like to admit. I've avoided incredible people because someone casually mentioned, "Oh, they're a bit odd," or "they're kind of intense." I've developed instant antipathy toward someone before exchanging a single word with them, all because of a throwaway comment at a party or a vague warning from a friend. And later, the regret hits like a freight train when you discover who that person actually is beneath the reputation. When you realize the difficult person was just honest, the cold person was simply reserved, the strange one was refreshingly authentic. How many connections have we lost? How many potential friendships or partnerships have disappeared into silence Because we believed the gossip instead of seeking the truth. Eleanor was standing at that exact crossroads, terrified of a monster that might not even exist. But now, let me tell you the other side of this story. Because every tale has one, right? We've been living inside Eleanor's terror, seeing Ashbourne through her eyes, or rather, through the eyes of everyone who whispered about him. But what about him? What about the man behind the reputation? The person buried beneath layers of carefully constructed mystery? See, Ashbourne didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a monster. Nobody does that. Monsters aren't born. They're made, shaped by circumstances, carved out of pain and survival instinct. And there's a brutal, massive difference between being something and appearing to be something. Ashbourne learned to appear dangerous because appearing dangerous kept him safe. It was armor, pure and simple. And like all armor, it protected him, but it also imprisoned him. Ashbourne didn't choose his life. It chose him. At 15 years old, barely more than a kid, he inherited his title after his father died suddenly. Imagine that for a second. You're 15, still figuring out who you are, still learning how the world works, and suddenly you're thrust into this position of enormous power and wealth. Young, rich, and completely alone in a world full of vultures. And you know what happens to someone like that? Everyone wants a piece. Suddenly you've got friends appearing out of nowhere, relatives you've never met showing up with sob stories and open hands, women who look at your title instead of your face. It's like being a walking ATM machine, except instead of cash, people are withdrawing pieces of your soul. Every smile becomes suspicious. Every kind word feels like a setup. Every relationship becomes a transaction you're trying to decode. It's exactly like winning the lottery and suddenly having 500 best friends you don't even recognize. People who wouldn't have crossed the street to say hello last week are now calling you family, showing up at your door with investment opportunities and urgent financial needs. You start seeing conspiracies everywhere because, honestly, some of them are real. You begin questioning every interaction. Do they want me? Or do they want what I have? Are they laughing at my joke because it's funny? Or because I'm rich? Is this affection genuine? Or is it theater? After a while, you stop trusting anyone. You can't afford to. Trust becomes a luxury you simply cannot afford. A forbidden indulgence that only fools pursue. The walls go up, brick by brick, until you're living in a fortress of your own making. Then came the event that changed everything. The moment that sealed Ashbourne's fate and turned him into the enigma everyone feared. At 20 years old, he fell in love. Really, truly fell. For the first time in his life, he thought someone actually saw him. Not the title, not the money, not the power, just him. He opened up completely, tore down every defense he'd built, shared things he'd kept hidden in the deepest, most concealed corners of his heart. He wrote letters, composed poetry, made plans for a future that felt real and possible. He was vulnerable in ways that terrified him, but it felt worth it because he thought he'd found someone safe. And her? She was using him to get close to his brother, who she actually wanted. He discovered this devastating truth on the very day he'd planned to propose, found evidence of the whole conspiracy laid out in letters she'd carelessly left behind. The betrayal wasn't just romantic, it was existential. I've never experienced anything quite that dramatic, but I remember a friendship I thought was genuine, real, solid as stone. I opened up to this person in ways I rarely did with anyone. Shared my fears, my insecurities, the things that kept me awake at night, vestiges of childhood trauma, current struggles, secret dreams I was afraid to say out loud. I trusted them with pieces of myself I usually kept locked away. And then I discovered they'd been using my confidences as entertainment, sharing my private pain as gossip with another group, turning my vulnerabilities into punchlines. That sensation of betrayal? It's physical. It's not just emotional hurt. It literally hurts in your chest, like someone's reached inside and squeezed your heart with a frozen fist. You feel stupid for trusting, angry at yourself for being vulnerable, and absolutely terrified of ever opening up again. After that betrayal, Ashbourne made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Never again. He consciously, deliberately created a reputation of coldness because cold things don't get hurt. Ice doesn't bruise. Stone doesn't bleed. He became ruthless in business because showing mercy was interpreted as weakness, and weakness invited attack. He stopped attending social gatherings because parties were just elaborate theater where everyone wore masks and spoke in codes, and he was exhausted from trying to decode the hidden meanings. He built walls so high that nobody could climb them, created such an intimidating presence that people kept their distance automatically. It was self-preservation, disguised as cruelty, protection masquerading as callousness. And you know what? It worked. People stopped trying to use him, stopped trying to manipulate him, stopped getting close enough to hurt him. Think about porcupines for a second, those spiky creatures that look so defensive and aggressive. But here's the thing about porcupine quills. They don't exist to attack. They exist to send a message that says, "Don't come near me." It's pure defense, not offense. Ashbourne became exactly that, a creature covered in spines that kept everyone at a safe distance. Nobody tried to hurt him again because nobody could get close enough to land a blow. His reputation preceded him into every room. The cold duke, the heartless businessman, the man with ice in his veins where blood should flow. And it functioned perfectly as a shield. He was untouchable, unreachable, safe in his fortress of calculated indifference. The mystery surrounding him grew with each passing year, fed by silence and distance. But here's the price nobody sees, the cost that never appears in the gossip or the whispered stories. He was absolutely exhausted. You know when you hold a fake smile for hours at an event, or maintain perfect posture during a long dinner, and when you finally get home your face hurts and your back aches. It was exactly like that, except with his entire soul. Maintaining the mask 24/7 was draining him dry, drop by drop. Every morning he had to put on the armor. Every interaction required him to be the Duke, cold, calculating, unapproachable. There was no moment of rest, no space where he could just be human. The exhaustion was bone deep, the kind that sleep can't fix, because it's not your body that's tired. It's your spirit. The real Ashbourne, the boy who'd once written poetry and dreamed of genuine connection, was slowly disappearing beneath the layers of protection. How many of you have different versions of yourselves? A work version that's professional and polished, a family version that's dutiful and appropriate, a social media version that's curated and enviable. And then you get home, close the door, and feel this creeping sensation that you don't even know who you really are anymore. That's what happened to Ashbourne, except magnified 1,000 times. He'd performed the role of the cold duke for so long that the performance had consumed the performer. The mask had fused to his face. The armor had become his skin. He looked in the mirror and saw only the character he played, not the person he actually was. The real him, with fears and hopes and the capacity for genuine warmth, had gone into hiding, buried so deep He'd almost forgotten it existed. He'd become his own mystery, a secret even to himself. So why agree to marry Eleanor if he'd sworn off genuine connection? Why go through with it? Simple. Pressure. Social expectation. The relentless weight of duty and tradition. He needed an heir. That's what dukes do, right? They produce the next generation, continue the bloodline, maintain the legacy. He needed to maintain appearances in high society, keep up the facade of normalcy, even while keeping everyone at arm's length. It was just another box to check, another obligation to fulfill, another performance in the endless theater of his life. He didn't choose Eleanor specifically. She wasn't special to him. She was simply convenient, available, appropriate, a transaction like everything else in his world had become. No different from signing a business contract or purchasing property. It was mechanical, emotionless, empty. And this absolutely breaks my heart, because how many things do we do just because we have to? How many relationships do we maintain because it's expected? How many paths do we walk not because we chose them, but because someone else decided that's where we should go? Ashbourne's life was a prison made of gold and silk and propriety. On paper, he had everything: wealth, status, power, respect, or at least fear, which often passes for respect. But in reality, he had nothing. No genuine friendship, no real intimacy, no moment of authentic connection. He was surrounded by people and completely alone, living in a mansion full of rooms, but no home, no sanctuary, no place where he could lower the drawbridge and let someone in. The silence in his life wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. So we arrive at the wedding night, this moment that both of them had been dreading for completely different reasons. Eleanor's terrified. We already know that. She's convinced she's about to face a monster, some cruel enigma wrapped in expensive clothes and cold indifference. Ashbourne's just tired, exhausted, down to his bones. For him, it's just another obligation checked off the list, another performance in the endless theater of duty. He doesn't even know she's scared of him. Why would he? He's so used to people fearing him that it's become background noise, like the ticking of a clock you stop hearing after a while. To him, this is simply the next scene in a play he never auditioned for. Another night of maintaining the armor, keeping the walls up, playing the role everyone expects. She enters the bedroom with her hands trembling so badly she can barely turn the doorknob. Every ghost story she's heard about him is playing on repeat in her mind like some twisted symphony of terror. Her heart's pounding so hard she's sure he can hear it across the room. He's standing with his back to her, staring out the window at the darkness beyond, and when he finally turns around, nothing happens the way she expected. She'd braced herself for aggression, for coldness, for contempt, for the monster everyone described. But the man who turned to face her had eyes that weren't made of ice or cruelty. They were just tired, deeply, profoundly tired. Like someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. And the very first thing he did? He took a step backward, away from her, creating distance instead of closing it. You know that feeling when you're braced for someone to yell at you and instead they speak quietly? Your brain completely short-circuits. You've prepared for battle and suddenly you're standing in silence, all that defensive energy with nowhere to go. Eleanor's entire nervous system glitched. Every rehearsed response, every defensive posture she'd unconsciously prepared, all of it became useless in an instant. She stood there, still trembling, but now confused. The script she'd been handed didn't match the scene unfolding in front of her. This wasn't the cold, merciless man from the stories. This was someone who looked almost as trapped as she felt. Someone whose reputation was perhaps the greatest mystery she'd ever encountered. The vestiges of her terror remained, but now they were mixed with something else. Confusion, and maybe, just maybe, the tiniest spark of curiosity. He saw the raw terror written all over her face. She wasn't good at hiding it, couldn't mask it even if she'd tried. And something in him, something he thought had died years ago, cracked open. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something other than numbness. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was recognition. Seeing his own fear reflected in someone else's eyes. Whatever it was, it broke through the armor just enough. He spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. You don't need to be afraid." She was still shaking, her voice coming out small and uncertain. "But the stories." And he gave her this sad, knowing smile that carried years of weight. "I know the stories," he said. "I created them." That admission hung in the air between them like smoke, like a secret finally spoken aloud after years of being buried in silence. They stood there in that charged silence, one on each side of the room like two people afraid to cross an invisible line. The tension wasn't romantic. It was the kind you feel before something breaks, before a storm hits, before everything changes. And then he asked her something that shifted the entire trajectory of their lives. "Can I ask you an honest question?" She nodded, barely breathing. "Did you want this marriage?" She shook her head, no, the truth escaping before she could dress it up in polite lies. "Neither did I," he said, and those 3 words contained more honesty than either of them had spoken in months. It was the first genuine exchange they'd had, free from the conspiracy of social expectations, stripped of all pretense. Just 2 people acknowledging a shared truth that nobody had asked them about before. And that's when everything changed. He sat down, but not on the bed or a chair, on the floor. An actual duke, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country, sitting on the floor of his own bedroom like a regular person who'd simply run out of energy to maintain appearances. Eleanor just stared at him, this forbidden gesture of informality that shattered every rule of propriety she'd ever learned. And he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "I've been waiting." She found herself asking, voice small, "Waiting for what?" His answer came out raw, unguarded. "For someone who'd see me as a person, not as a title, not as a monster, just someone who'd ask who I actually am." The hidden truth of his loneliness, concealed for so many years, was finally visible. Man, this hit me hard because it reminded me of when I was drowning in anxiety, but keeping everything functional on the surface. Showing up, doing the work, maintaining the smile, checking all the boxes. And one day, someone simply asked, "How are you really?" Not the casual, "How are you?" That's basically just another way of saying hello. But, "How are you really?" With eye contact and genuine concern. And I just collapsed. Completely fell apart. Because nobody had asked. Everyone saw the functional version and assumed everything was fine. They saw the armor and never thought to ask what was underneath it or why I needed it in the first place. When someone finally did ask, when they looked past the performance, the relief was so intense it almost hurt. That's what happened between Eleanor and Ashbourne in that moment. Someone finally asked the real question. Eleanor slowly sat down, too. On the floor. In her full wedding dress, silk and lace pooling around her like water. The absurdity of it should have been funny. A duchess and duke sitting on the floor on their wedding night like children. But it wasn't funny. It was real. Maybe the first real moment either of them had experienced in years. And she asked him the question he'd been waiting to hear. Who are you, really? And for the first time in forever, Ashbourne didn't have a prepared answer. He'd spent so many years being what others expected, playing the role, maintaining the reputation, that he'd genuinely forgotten who existed underneath all those layers. He opened his mouth to respond and realized he didn't know anymore. The real him had disappeared so completely that finding him again felt like archaeology, digging through layers of sediment to find vestiges of someone who'd once existed. They talked through the entire night. Not about politics or business or society gossip. None of the usual aristocratic small talk. They talked about fear, about loneliness that echoes in expensive hallways, about the crushing weight of being who everyone else expects you to be, instead of who you actually are. She discovered things about him that would have shocked the gossips. He read poetry in secret, hiding the books behind serious-looking volumes about economics and law. He was terrified of thunderstorms, had been since childhood, but could never admit it, because fear wasn't part of his character. He missed having real friends, people who'd call him out when he was wrong, who'd laugh at his terrible jokes, who'd just exist with him without wanting anything. These revelations came out slowly, carefully, like he was testing whether it was safe to speak them aloud. It's like when you take off a suit of medieval armor after wearing it all day. At first, you feel completely exposed, vulnerable, like you're naked and defenseless. Your instinct screams at you to put it back on, to protect yourself, to hide again. But then you take your first deep breath in hours, and you realize your ribs can actually expand fully. You feel air on your skin. You remember what it's like to move freely, without all that weight pulling you down. You remember you're human, not just a walking fortress. That's what was happening to Ashbourne as he talked. He was remembering what it felt like to be a person instead of a reputation. Each honest word was like removing another piece of armor, and, yeah, it was terrifying. But it was also the closest thing to freedom he'd felt in years. As dawn started creeping through the windows, painting everything in soft gray light. When Eleanor was already half asleep on the floor, still in her wedding dress, he said it again, quieter this time. I was waiting for you. Not for a wife. Not for an heir or a social arrangement. For someone who'd let me be human again. And she, barely conscious, murmured back, I was waiting too. For someone who wasn't the monster they told me about. That exchange, soft as a whisper in the growing light, was more intimate than anything physical could have been. It was two people choosing to see each other, really see each other, past the stories and masks and carefully constructed lies. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that exists between people who've finally stopped performing. That night wasn't romantic in the fairy tale sense. There were no passionate declarations or sweeping gestures, no orchestral music swelling in the background. But it was something better, something more real. It was liberating in a way that romance rarely is. Two prisoners recognizing each other through the bars of their separate cells, realizing they'd been locked up right next to each other all along. Two people who'd been playing roles finally, dropping the script and discovering they liked the real person underneath better anyway. They didn't fall in love that night. That would come later. But they found something rarer. They found safety. They found someone who wouldn't use their secrets as weapons, who wouldn't exploit their vulnerabilities, who'd guard their hidden truths as carefully as their own. In a world built on conspiracies and social theater, they'd stumbled into something revolutionary: honesty. In the days and weeks that followed that transformative night, Eleanor started discovering layers of Ashbourne that nobody else knew existed. It was like peeling back curtains in a house everyone assumed was abandoned, only to find rooms full of life and warmth hidden in the darkness. Every conversation revealed something new, some piece of the puzzle that completely contradicted the monster everyone had described. She began to understand that reputation and reality are often two completely different things, separated by silence and assumptions, and the stories people tell when the truth is too complicated to bother with. The enigma of who he really was started unraveling, thread by thread, and what she found underneath was nothing like what she'd expected. It was better and worse and infinitely more complex than any gossip could capture. Take those families he supposedly ruined with his cruelty, the story everyone loved to tell as proof of his heartlessness. Eleanor dug into it, asked questions, looked at actual records instead of accepting the narrative at face value. And here's what she discovered. Those weren't innocent victims. They were exploiters, people who'd made their fortunes by mistreating their workers, paying starvation wages, creating dangerous working conditions, treating human beings like disposable tools. Ashbourne had simply enforced existing labor laws and collected debts that were legitimately owed. He'd stood up for people who had no voice, no power, no protection. But the rich families he'd held accountable? They called it cruelty. They spread stories about his heartlessness, turned him into a villain in their social circles. Meanwhile, the workers, the ones who'd actually suffered, they called it justice. They whispered grateful prayers for the Duke who'd actually seen them as human. But nobody listened to workers. Their version of the story stayed hidden, buried in silence. Then there was his notorious isolation, his refusal to attend social gatherings that everyone interpreted as contempt for company. The gossip painted him as someone who thought he was too good for others, who looked down on society from his lofty position. But Eleanor discovered the truth. He didn't go to parties because he couldn't stomach the falseness anymore. The fake laughter, the backhanded compliments, the constant performance of caring about things nobody actually cared about. It exhausted him. But here's what nobody knew, what he'd kept completely hidden. He'd been funding orphanages for years, paying for poor kids to get educations they'd never otherwise receive, supporting widows who'd lost everything, all of it done in complete secrecy, through anonymous donations and carefully concealed transactions. And you know why he hid it? Because he didn't want to become the charitable Duke. Didn't want that to become another mask, another role, another way for people to use him or expect things from him. And that woman who'd supposedly left his estate in tears, the one everyone cited as proof of his cruelty? Eleanor finally got the real story, and it was nothing like the version that had circulated through drawing rooms. The woman had come to Ashbourne asking for financial help, but she'd tried to use seduction to get it, thinking she could manipulate him through romance or physical attraction. He'd refused politely, explained he wouldn't mix personal feelings with business decisions. She'd caused a massive public scene, screaming and crying and making accusations. And here's the thing that killed me. He could have destroyed her reputation by telling everyone the truth. Could have exposed what she'd actually tried to do. But he didn't. He protected her reputation by staying silent, taking the hit to his own character instead. The version that spread? That he'd humiliated her, been cruel and dismissive. The reality? He'd been one of the few men who'd treated her with actual respect by not taking advantage of her desperate situation. The central analogy here is perfect. It's like looking at an iceberg. Everyone stares at the 10% that's visible above water and thinks they understand the whole thing. They see that small portion and make judgments, create stories, spread gossip. Look at that iceberg. It's not even that big. I know everything about it. But 90% is underwater, hidden, invisible, unless you dive deep. And it's that hidden 90% that tells the real story, that contains the actual truth, that explains why things are the way they are. We do this with people constantly. Judge them based on the tiny visible portion while remaining completely ignorant about the massive reality beneath the surface. Every reputation is an iceberg, and we're all guilty of thinking we know the whole story when we've barely glimpsed the beginning. I had a professor in high school that literally everyone hated. I mean, we despised this guy. He was rigid, demanding, never gave compliments, never seemed satisfied with anyone's work. We complained about him constantly, created elaborate theories about why he was so miserable, nicknamed him the Iceman behind his back. Years later, I ran into a former classmate who'd stayed in touch with the school, and she told me something that completely shattered my understanding. That professor had been paying for school supplies for poor students out of his own pocket. Staying after hours to help kids who were struggling, not because he had to, but because he cared. He'd done all of this in complete secrecy, never seeking recognition or praise. The public reputation was heartless professor. The hidden truth? He cared so deeply it hurt, but he showed it through actions rather than words, through quiet support rather than public displays. One night, Ashbourne asked Eleanor a question that honestly broke something in me. If I'd been kind from the beginning, would I have survived? Or would they have devoured me? And that's the question that haunts me, because the answer is uncomfortable. In that world, in our world too, if we're honest, vulnerability is often punished. Kindness is seen as weakness. Openness becomes an invitation for exploitation. So people build fortresses, create armor, develop reputations that keep them safe. They become mysteries wrapped in silence because exposure means danger. And then, what do? We complain that nobody's authentic anymore. We criticize people for being closed off, for having walls, for not being real. But when someone is authentic, when they lower their guard, we judge it as weakness or use it against them. It's an impossible game with rules designed to make everyone lose. Eleanor realized something that most people never figure out. Society creates monsters by demanding perfection and punishing vulnerability. We expect people to be strong, successful, invulnerable, and then we condemn them for being cold or distant or unapproachable. We create the conditions that force people to hide, and then we criticize them for hiding. We spread gossip and conspiracies about why they are the way they are, never considering that maybe, just maybe, we're part of the reason. Ashbourne became the man he was because being soft, being open, being kind had been dangerous. His cruelty wasn't natural, it was protective. His coldness wasn't his personality, it was his survival strategy, and nobody bothered to ask why until Eleanor did. Here's the uncomfortable question I want you to sit with. How many times have you criticized someone for being cold without knowing that coldness was armor they wore to survive? How many times have you called someone distant without realizing that distance was the only thing keeping them sane? How many times have you gossiped about someone's behavior without knowing the full story, without diving below the surface to see what was really going on? We love simple narratives, villain and victim, good and bad, cold and warm. But people aren't simple. They're icebergs, and we almost never see what's underneath. We judge the visible 10% and think we've figured them out completely, never realizing we're missing the whole truth. The real truth about reputations is this: they're stories other people tell when you're not in the room. And most of the time, those stories are fiction. They're telephone games where details change with each retelling. They're projections of people's own fears and assumptions. They're entertainment dressed up as fact. They're everything except the complete, complicated, messy truth. Ashbourne's reputation was built on fragments and assumptions and convenient narratives. The real man, the one who read poetry and feared storms and quietly helped people he'd never meet, that man was forbidden from existing in public. He'd been erased by gossip, replaced by a character that was easier to understand, easier to fear, easier to talk about. And the tragedy is, he started believing the character himself. The mask became the face. The reputation became the prison. Eleanor and Ashbourne did something incredibly rare in their world. They built real trust. Not the polite, surface-level kind where you exchange pleasantries and keep your actual thoughts hidden. Not the transactional kind where trust is just another currency to trade. They built the deep, foundational kind that takes work and time and a willingness to be uncomfortable. And here's the thing nobody tells you about building something real. It wasn't instant. It wasn't magic. It wasn't love at first sight or some romantic revelation that changed everything overnight. It was slow, deliberate, sometimes painful work. Like building a house brick by brick, instead of wishing one would appear fully formed. They had to make choices every single day to keep showing up honestly, to keep removing the armor piece by piece, to keep trusting even when it scared them. The enigma wasn't how they fell in love. It was how they chose to stay vulnerable long enough for love to grow. They established concrete steps, actual practices that kept them grounded in reality instead of slipping back into performance. Step 1 was radical honesty, and I mean radical. They made an agreement, no masks between them, ever. If one of them was angry, they said it out loud instead of smiling through gritted teeth. If they were scared, they admitted it instead of pretending to be fine. If they were confused or hurt or disappointed, they spoke those truths instead of burying them in silence. No more, everything's fine, when it clearly wasn't. No more pretending just to keep the peace. This sounds simple, but it's terrifying in practice. Being honest means being seen, and being seen means being vulnerable to judgment and rejection. But they committed to it anyway, knowing it was the only way to build something that would last. Step 2 was reciprocal vulnerability, the kind where both people share the weight equally. This wasn't one person dumping their trauma while the other played therapist. It wasn't one person always strong while the other was always weak. When Ashbourne opened up about something painful, Eleanor opened up too. When she shared a fear, he shared one back. It was balanced, equal, a genuine exchange rather than a one-way confession. This matters more than people realize because relationships die when the vulnerability only flows in one direction. When one person is always the strong one and the other is always falling apart, resentment builds like sediment in a river. But when both people take turns being strong and being vulnerable, when both people trust each other with their hidden truths, that's when real connection happens. That's when you stop being two separate people performing a relationship and start being an actual team. Step 3 was mutual protection. They became each other's safe harbor in a storm. The outside world could be brutal, full of gossip and conspiracies and people trying to use them for personal gain. But inside their marriage, that was sacred territory. That was where they could lower their defenses completely without fear. Ashbourne didn't have to be the cold duke at home. Eleanor didn't have to be the perfect duchess. They could be messy, imperfect, fully human. They protected each other's secrets like treasures, guarded each other's vulnerabilities like precious things that could shatter if handled carelessly. When someone attacked one of them publicly, the other stood firm. When one of them struggled, the other held space for that struggle without trying to fix it or minimize it. They created what every human being desperately needs but rarely finds: a place where you can be yourself without consequences. Here's my favorite analogy for what they were doing. It's like planting a tree. In the beginning, you've got this fragile little sapling that looks like it might die if you breathe on it wrong. You water it every single day, protect it from harsh weather, give it nutrients, and for months, sometimes years, you see almost no visible change. It doesn't give you fruit. It doesn't provide shade. It just sits there being small and vulnerable, demanding constant care. And you might wonder if you're wasting your time, if maybe you should have just bought a fully grown tree instead. But you keep showing up. You keep watering. You keep protecting. And then one day, you look up, and there's an actual tree there. Strong, beautiful, capable of weathering storms you couldn't have imagined when it was just a sapling. Real relationships are exactly like this. They require daily tending, patience, faith that growth is happening even when you can't see it. The impact on their world became visible gradually, like dawn breaking. Society noticed the change before they fully realized it themselves. Ashbourne started smiling in public, not the cold, calculated smile he'd perfected, but real warmth that reached his eyes. Eleanor began speaking her opinions instead of just nodding politely, and people were shocked to discover she was brilliant, funny, insightful. They attended events together, but the dynamic was completely different now. They weren't two separate people doing their duties in parallel. They were a team. You could see it in the way they stood closer, the way they exchanged glances that held entire conversations, the way they defended each other without hesitation. The gossip shifted from the cold Duke and his frightened wife to something else entirely, something people couldn't quite define, but could definitely feel. The mystery of their relationship became the talk of society, but for different reasons now. The transformation in Ashbourne was profound but subtle. He didn't abandon his reputation completely. That would have been foolish and dangerous in his position. He still maintained firmness in business dealings, still commanded respect, still kept most people at arm's length. But now he had someone who saw beyond the armor, who knew that firmness wasn't the totality of who he was. And that made all the difference. Knowing someone sees your full humanity allows you to be strategic about when you wear the armor, instead of being trapped inside it permanently. At home, he could finally exhale, could be silly, vulnerable, uncertain, could admit when he was wrong, could ask for help. The weight he'd been carrying for years started to lift, not because the responsibilities disappeared, but because he wasn't carrying them alone anymore. He'd found what had been lost for so long, a genuine witness to his real self. Eleanor's transformation was equally powerful. She discovered she had a voice, a strong one. She had opinions that mattered, ideas worth sharing, strength she'd never been allowed to access before. She'd spent her entire life being invisible, trained to fade into the background, taught that her purpose was to look pretty and stay quiet and not cause problems. But with someone who actually saw her, who listened when she spoke, who valued her thoughts, she flourished, started involving herself in his business decisions and making them better, started speaking up at social gatherings and commanding attention, started taking up space instead of apologizing for existing. It's like she'd been holding her breath her whole life, and suddenly she remembered how to breathe. The vestiges of her old, frightened self were still there, but they were joined by something new: confidence, purpose, power. Think about learning to swim. That terrifying moment when you have to let go of the edge of the pool. At first, you grip that edge with everything you've got, absolutely convinced you'll sink like a stone if you release it. Your entire body tenses up. Your fear tells you that holding on is survival. But then, someone you trust is there, encouraging you, showing you it's safe. And you finally let go. And you know what happens? You float. You realize the water holds you. You had the capacity all along. You just needed safe water to discover it in. That's what happened to both of them. They'd been clinging to their defenses, their masks, their reputations like lifelines. But in the safety of their relationship, they finally let go and discovered they could float. They could be vulnerable without drowning. They could be real without being destroyed. The lesson they learned, the one that changed everything, was this: authenticity is a luxury that only exists in safe spaces. You cannot ask someone to remove their armor if you're pointing a weapon at them. You cannot demand vulnerability while creating an environment where vulnerability gets punished. You cannot expect people to show you their real selves if you've given them every reason to believe their real self will be rejected or exploited. Trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by proving day after day that you won't weaponize what you learn. Eleanor and Ashbourne created that safety for each other, and in doing so, they gave each other the greatest gift possible: permission to be fully human. I have a friendship like this. Took years to build, but now it's solid as bedrock. I can call at 3 in the morning having a crisis and know I won't be judged. Can say stupid things, make mistakes, be completely imperfect, and the love doesn't waver. Can share secrets that would devastate me if they got out, and trust completely that they'll stay hidden in safe hands. Can be weak when I need to be weak, and strong when I need to be strong. And neither version is valued more than the other. This kind of relationship is rare. It's gold. It's the thing that makes life bearable when everything else falls apart. And it only happens when two people make a conscious choice to be real with each other, to protect each other's vulnerability, to show up even when it's hard. Eleanor and Ashbourne found this, and it saved them both. The final truth about their story is this: they didn't get a fairy tale happily ever after, where everything was perfect and easy forever. That's not real. What they got was better. They got a real relationship, one with conflicts and disagreements and moments of frustration, one that required ongoing work, daily choices to stay open and honest. But it was built on a foundation so solid that storms couldn't knock it down. They'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. They'd shared their deepest fears and had them treated with care. They'd revealed the parts of themselves they usually kept hidden and found acceptance instead of rejection. They'd built something that could withstand the weight of reality because it was based on truth rather than fantasy. And honestly, that's the kind of love worth having. The kind that survives contact with real life. The kind that grows stronger through challenges rather than shattering at the first sign of difficulty. So here's what I need you to understand. This isn't just a story about a duke and duchess from centuries ago. This is about you, right now, today. How many people in your life have you judged based on rumors, gossip, or someone else's version of their story? How many connections have you lost because you believed the surface-level narrative instead of digging for the truth? How many times have you been the person hiding behind armor because showing your real self felt too dangerous? Eleanor and Ashbourne's story is a mirror, and if you're honest with yourself, you'll see your own reflection staring back. The question is, What are you going to do about it? Think about that person at work everyone says is difficult. That family member people warn you to avoid. That acquaintance with the bad reputation. Have you ever actually talked to them? Really talked. Not polite small talk, but genuine conversation where you ask who they are instead of assuming you already know. Or have you just accepted the collective story, added your own assumptions to the pile, and moved on? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Every time you do that, you might be creating another Ashbourne. Another person who has to build walls higher, wear armor thicker, hide deeper. You might be the reason someone else can't be authentic. You might be part of the conspiracy of silence that buries the truth under layers of gossip and fear. And what about you? What masks are you wearing right now because taking them off feels too risky? What parts of yourself have you hidden because you're afraid of judgment, rejection, or betrayal? Who's the real you underneath all the performance? And when was the last time you let that person breathe? Ashbourne spent years being exhausted because he couldn't be human. Eleanor spent weeks in terror because she believed lies instead of seeking truth. Don't waste your life doing either. Don't be so busy protecting yourself that you forget who you're protecting. Don't be so quick to judge others that you become the villain in someone else's story. The armor that keeps you safe also keeps you lonely. The reputation that protects you also imprisons you. Here's what I want you to do. Actually do, not just think about doing. First, identify one person you've judged based on reputation alone. Just one. And this week, have a real conversation with them. Ask them who they are. Listen without assuming you already know the answer. Second, find one person you trust, really trust, and tell them something true about yourself that you usually keep hidden. Practice being vulnerable in either a safe space. See what happens when you let someone see the real you instead of the performed version. Third, the next time you hear gossip about someone, stop it. Don't spread it. Don't add to it. Ask yourself, do I actually know this is true? Or am I just repeating what someone else said? Break the cycle. Be the person who refuses to participate in destroying someone's reputation based on incomplete information. Now, let me ask you some questions, and I want you to really sit with them. Don't just scroll past. Actually think about your answers. Are you living authentically, or are you performing a role? When was the last time you asked someone, "Who are you really?" instead of accepting the story everyone tells? What would change in your life if you stopped judging people based on reputation and started seeking the truth instead? What would it feel like to take off your armor in a safe space? Who would you be if you weren't so afraid of being hurt? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are the questions that change lives when you answer them honestly. These are the questions Eleanor asked that transformed everything. You have a choice right now. You can watch this video, think interesting story, and continue living exactly as you were. Judging quickly, trusting gossip, wearing masks, keeping people at distance. Or you can actually apply what you've learned here. You can become the person who digs deeper, who asks real questions, who creates safe spaces for authenticity. You can be the Eleanor in someone's life, the person brave, enough to see past the reputation. Or you can be the Ashbourne who finally takes off the armor because you've found people worth trusting. The knowledge is useless without application. The story means nothing if it doesn't change how you move through the world. So, what's it going to be? More of the same, or something real? If this resonated with you, if you're tired of surface-level connections and performative relationships, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Because we're going deep into topics like this. We're exploring the uncomfortable truths about human connection, vulnerability, reputation, and what it really takes to build something authentic in a world obsessed with appearances. We're diving into the mysteries that live beneath the surface, the secrets people hide, the stories that never get told because they're too complicated for gossip. This isn't content you'll find everywhere else. This is the real stuff, the conversations that actually matter, the wisdom that changes how you see yourself and others. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let's keep learning together. Because the world needs more people who ask, "Who are you really?" instead of accepting the lies everyone else is comfortable believing.